you. It's very nice to be here. Yes, I'm going to talk about some of our work over the last 20 years or more on methods of trying to improve the reading and language performance of children with weaknesses in these areas. I'd quite like to start with a kind of overview of what I'm going to tell you. Learning to read depends upon a child's oral language skills, which develop to a very great degree before school entry. When we talk about reading and reading difficulties, it's very critical to make a clear distinction between different aspects of reading, and in particular what's usually referred to as decoding or reading aloud is different from reading comprehension. In relation to children's ability to learn to decode print, that depends critically upon so-called phonological or speech sound skills, and particularly the development of a child's ability to identify phonemes in speech, and their ability to learn letter-sound correspondence relationships are two of the most critical longitudinal determinants of variations in the development of decoding skills. I'll show you data supporting these very broad claims in a moment or two. And we've shown that interventions that promote those two skills can be highly effective as means of improving children's decoding skills. In a second strand of research, we've looked at oral language comprehension and methods of improving that, and shown now in a number of studies, I'll just talk about one study today, but we've shown in a number of studies that interventions to improve children's ability to comprehend speech are effective means of improving their reading comprehension. We get direct transfer from interventions to improve oral language comprehension to outcomes on reading comprehension. And I'll make a plea that interventions should develop from theory, and that interventions can be powerful ways of testing causal theories we may have about the factors affecting the development of different skills. If we start with a very simple theory, the so-called simple view of reading, developed by Phil Goff and Bill Tunmer, they draw attention to these two dimensions: a dimension that's related to variations in children's decoding skills, and another dimension that's related to variations in their language comprehension skills. If both language comprehension and decoding are operating well, then we have a child who's a normal reader and no one's concerned about them. If, on the other hand, we have children with particularly poor decoding skills in the presence of relatively good listening comprehension skills, they are classically defined dyslexic children, children of normal to good verbal ability, but who have great problems learning to read. Another group of children, much less recognised, but roughly about as common as children with dyslexia, are children whom we could refer to as poor comprehenders. These kids have adequate to good decoding skills, but very poor oral language comprehension abilities. So they can read aloud stories quite well, but then when you ask them what's happened in the story, they look at you a bit puzzled and make up an answer that doesn't actually answer what you need them to say. And of course, within this framework, we may get children who have both sorts of problems, and they will have the most severe difficulties. Okay, if we talk about reading in the sense of learning to decode print, I think it's now very well established that children's speech sound skills are critical for that process. And in particular, we've been very influenced by an idea put forward by Brian Byrne, that the child in learning to read needs to understand what Brian refers to as the alphabetic principle. The alphabetic principle is simply the idea that in an alphabetic orthography like English, letters map onto phonemes or the individual speech sound units in spoken words most of the time. We all know there are irregularities in the English orthography, but nevertheless, to a first approximation, that's how English, like any other alphabetic orthography, works. And it follows from that really that children's early letter knowledge and their ability to identify phonemes in spoken words are likely to be two causal influences on variations in children's ability to learn to read. I can see people standing at the back. Do you want to grab a chair?
Sure.
Looks a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, thank you.
Other chairs there?
There's lots of chairs here. So, some years ago, we did a large-scale longitudinal study of children who were just in their first term of primary school education. And we gave them a very large battery of measures assessing different aspects of phonological ability. We looked at their rhyming abilities, their ability to identify phonemes in speech. We also looked at measures of verbal ability, single word reading, letter knowledge, grammatical abilities, and at the end of the study we also had measures of reading comprehension. Here's a very simplified path model of the data from that study. Phoneme deletion and segmentation ability measured after a year in school, together with letter knowledge and the child's earlier word recognition ability, are very powerful predictors of variations in word reading after 2 years in school. In fact, those three predictors account for almost 90% of the individual differences in reading ability in this model. I should say these things in turn are strongly influenced by variations in these skills at school entry, which is omitted from this model. Conversely, if we swap the outcome variable in that path model to children, a measure of children's reading comprehension ability, there's still a very strong prediction from children's word recognition ability, as we would expect. Their ability to read the text aloud is a powerful predictor of variations in reading comprehension. But in addition, variations in children's vocabulary knowledge measured 2 years earlier, and variations in their grammatical ability, their ability to deal with the grammatical structure of spoken sentences, are both additional powerful predictors of variations in prediction. This then is pretty well exactly in line with the simple view of reading, that model I showed you earlier, that variations in these proxies for language comprehension are powerful predictors of reading comprehension, as are variations in children's word reading skills. So, just to summarise the theory, learning to read can be thought about as having at least two different components. Learning to decode print depends critically upon letter sound knowledge and phoneme awareness, amongst some other skills. And learning to comprehend text depends upon what I'd call higher level or broader oral language skills. And two critical components of children's oral language skills for the development of reading comprehension are variations in children's semantic skills or their knowledge of word meanings, and variations in their ability to parse the grammatical structure of speech. And it follows, as night follows day really, from this view that there are going to be at least two forms of reading difficulty that arise from different forms of language weakness. Problems with decoding or dyslexia, which reflect specifically problems in the phonological aspects of language, and problems with reading comprehension, which depend upon broader oral language skills outside phonology. is all of that okay? Are there any questions or comments, or are you happy for me to go on? Okay, let me talk about a small proportion of the work that we've done looking at methods of improving children's decoding skills, much of which is dealt with in some detail in this book that we published a few years ago with Blackwell. The first study that I was ever involved with examining this issue was published in 1994, and in that study we proposed something that we referred to as the sound linkage hypothesis. Broadly in this study we tested the idea that to be effective, training children's phonological skills needed to be directly linked with systematic instruction in reading to be maximally effective. In order to test that idea, we did an experimental study in which we recruited children who were living in an area of the north of England, Cumbria, and basically we identified pretty well all of the children within that area who had the lowest levels of word reading skill after roughly 2 years in school. So these kids were 7.5 years of age when we recruited them into the study, and we randomly assigned those children to 4 different conditions. One group was a control group who got no additional teaching. Another group was a group who were given highly systematic phonically based reading instruction. Another group were given phonological training. This is training particularly in identifying in identifying sounds in spoken words and learning about how those relate to letters. And finally we had this combined group which had both the systematic reading instruction coupled with the phonological intervention. And all the materials for this, or most of the materials for this, and as of the tests we used in this study have been published and republished a number of times. So in this study, we had the following design. We recruited highly skilled teachers who had a lot of experience of working with children with reading difficulties. And in this study, we trained the teachers to deliver each of these 3 different forms of teaching. And we, I think, quite genuinely persuaded the teachers that each of these 3 methods ought to help the children that they were working with. The teachers were given extensive training and were given all the materials they needed for the intervention, and one critical part of the intervention is the use of books that are graded in their difficulty for children to read, so that teachers can have children reading books that are very carefully selected to be at an appropriate level of instructional difficulty. And the kids receive 2 half-hour lessons each week in school for 20 weeks. The results shown here in terms of changes in reading age are that the Reading with Phonology programme was substantially more effective than either the Reading Alone or the Phonology Alone programme. So the lapse between pre-test and post-test here is roughly 6 months, and in terms of age equivalent scores we've got a change of about 12 months in 6 months in the children given the Reading with Phonology programme. If you consider that these children are roughly the worst 10% of all children in that area for reading, by definition, before the study began, they were making less than the age-appropriate progress in learning to read. So for them to make twice the expected rate of progress over those 6 months is In terms of effect sizes, we've got moderate effect sizes in this study varying between about 0.40 and 0.60. So I think these are clearly gains that are quite substantial statistically and quite substantial in terms of their educational significance. In terms of trying to explain to you what's involved in this intervention, each lesson in the reading and phonology intervention basically consists of a kind of sandwich. It begins with the child rereading a book that's deemed to be at the easy level of reading, which is that a book that's selected that the child will be able to read with greater than 94% accuracy. This is where the use of these graded books is so important. While the child is reading, the teacher takes a so-called running record. That is, they make a note, they record on a form every reading error that the child makes. And they use those reading errors then to inform the sort of teaching they do in the middle of the lesson, which is to work on children's letter identification. So for some children maybe, for example, confusing the letter B and D. So if that's the case, you'll work on those letters. Some children may also be having problems with the phonological or sound structure of words, and there'll be phonological awareness training. And there'll also be some work in writing, which also reinforces work on letter identification. And then at the end of the lesson, the children are introduced to a new book, which is selected to be slightly more difficult, and they do some reading from that. So the basic structure here is to do work on letter identification and phonological skills in the context of the children reading meaningful children's books and hopefully enjoying those books. So a critical aspect of this reading and phonology program is it combines a lot of practice in reading at an appropriate level of difficulty. The form of teaching here is highly structured. The teachers are given lesson plans which give them pretty well minute-by-minute instructions about the form of work they should be doing. But it's also highly individualised because the teachers are always identifying the level at which they should be working with a given child. And the use of this running record allows teachers to identify the areas of difficulty for each particular child and target those areas of difficulty in their lesson. So, in terms of the practical implications of this research, I think this research and further research we've done following on from this shows quite clearly that this approach to the teaching of reading to children with problems in learning to decode print can be highly effective. Theoretically, I think this also shows that prior to this work, a lot of people had argued that phonological training alone was a pretty good way of dealing with children's reading difficulties, and I think this research shows quite clearly that phonological training alone actually isn't sufficient. It doesn't produce the direct generalisation to improvements in reading that people would like it to. In fact, the children here who were given phonological training alone actually did much better on our tests of phonological ability than the children who were in the reading with phonology program, but they didn't read nearly as well as I've already shown you. Okay, going on from that, over a number of years we've extended our interventions to look at methods of improving children's oral language comprehension abilities. And I'll talk about one such study which was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, which we typically refer to as the Nuffield Early Language Intervention. So our aim here was to compare the reading intervention, the form of reading intervention I've already told you about, to the effects of an intervention that was designed not to improve reading, but instead to improve children's oral language comprehension abilities. And to be honest, at the time we did this, I guess we pretty well knew that the Reading with Phonology programme would work because we'd already shown it worked, but we were much less sure about whether we'd be able to improve these broader oral language skills. We'd never tried to do it before. So we developed and compared the effects of two different 20-week intervention programmes, a phonology and reading programme and an oral language programme. This was an RCT with people blind to group membership, and we had pre-test, mid-test, post-test, maintenance test, as well as a longer-term follow-up test. So for this study, we recruited around 150 kids who were in about 15 different schools. This just gives you some background information on those children. So these children were identified at school entry as the children in each class with the weakest oral language skills. As you can see, these children are broadly low ability. They also have a relatively high proportion of these children are in receipt of free school meals. Free school meals in the UK would be one of the kind of gold standard measures of social disadvantage. Basically, to be getting free school meals, you probably need to be in a one-parent household where the parent isn't working. You're basically living with your mum who's unemployed and probably no doubt present. This is a fairly low ability disadvantage sample. I guess that's the message. Having identified the sample, we used two different methods of teaching over the 20 weeks of the programme. In the Reading with Phonology programme, this is an extension, a downward extension of the sorts of approach to teaching of reading that I've already told you about. Training in letter sound knowledge, training in phonological awareness, reading books at an appropriate level, work to develop sight vocabulary and work to develop children's ability to write letters. And we contrasted that with an oral language intervention which focused particularly on teaching children the meaning of new words, teaching them to listen to and answer questions about simple stories, work on expressive language, getting children to tell stories based on picture prompts, and work on teaching them to make inferences from simple text, and work on from simple spoken language, and work on developing, generating questions about what may have happened given a simple story that had been spoken to them. Another change in this study was that in the previous study I told you about, we used highly trained teachers. In this study, all of the intervention was delivered by specially trained teaching assistants. I don't know if you have people equivalent to teaching assistants in Australian schools. I suspect you do. These people are employed usually rather badly paid, sometimes quite variable in their qualifications. Anyway, we took teaching assistants or teacher helpers and trained them to deliver both of these programmes, and the programmes were delivered in alternating group and small groups and individual sessions. And we used a wide range of measures, as you would imagine, measures of language skills, and measures of reading and phonological skills. The basic pattern of results here is shown in this bar chart. These are relative advantages for the language group in Z-score units. So the height of these bars would basically affect the equivalent to Cohen's D. And what you can see is that we got improvements in the talk vocabulary on a measure called the bus story, measure of oral grammatical competence, the action pitch test, grammar test. And conversely, for the reading and phonology group, we got large improvements, significant improvements in letter knowledge, spelling, large decrease in the number of reading errors, marginally significant effect on a measure of single word reading, and a large improvement in their ability to segment and blend phonemes in spoken words. So it's probably important, I think, to emphasise that this is a relatively conservative design. We've got no untreated control group here. Everybody's getting help for the same amount of time. It's just that they're getting two very different forms of help, either a decoding intervention or an oral language intervention, and we get contrasting effects. What accounts for the improvements in word reading skills that are seen in the reading and phonology programme? I've outlined to you this theory that says that two critical determinants of children's ability to decode text are their ability to learn the sounds of letters and their ability to identify or manipulate phonemes in speech. We can therefore conduct mediation analyses to try to assess the extent to which the effects of the intervention is mediated by these two intervening variables. So here's the results of a mediation model. Before the intervention begins, we've randomly assigned kids to the two groups, represented by a dummy variable. We've taken a measure of their early word reading, which is at a very low level. We've also got a measure of general ability here. But the basic message from this mediation model is that the group assignment to the reading, being in the reading group, produces substantial improvements in phoneme awareness and letter knowledge measured at the end of the intervention period, that's after 6 months. And changes in these two intervening variables in turn are strongly related to variations in children's literacy outcome, which is a composite measure of their single word reading and single word spelling. And in this model, in fact, we get complete mediation. A direct effective group here falls to completely non-significant levels. So I think this mediation model provides very strong support for the causal theory that led to the development of the reading and phonology intervention programme. Okay, any questions or comments? I'm about to go on to a different kind of area now. Okay, so far I've really been talking about interventions principally to develop the accuracy of decoding print in children who have problems in the phonological domain of language. We also wanted to consider this other group of children referred to as poor comprehenders, who are much less widely recognised in the educational system, certainly in the UK. I imagine the same is true in Australia, and see the extent to which we could develop interventions that would be suitable for this group of kids. This is another book that we published with a similar cover, dealing with rather different work, looking at this issue. So, children with reading comprehension impairment show a sharply contrasting pattern to that seen in dyslexia. These kids typically show adequate decoding skills coupled with quite severe problems in comprehending text that they can decode. So these children can read aloud a passage quite accurately, so the teachers think they can read fine. But when you ask them questions about what they've read, they simply fail to answer those questions adequately. And to summarise a huge amount of research, these children are typically characterised by having normal phonological skills, but impairments in non-phonological oral language skills. And two areas in which these children are certainly clearly deficient are in vocabulary knowledge and their oral grammatical skills. This slide, I think, just gives references to a number of studies that have looked at different aspects of oral language skills in children selected for having reading comprehension impairment, and they show problems in a wide range of oral language skills. And as I've already said, if we look within the general population, variations in grammatical and vocabulary skills are strong predictors of variations in reading comprehension. This is the path diagram I showed you earlier from an early longitudinal study of ours, showing that variations in these two skills are powerful predictors of variations in reading comprehension after 2 years in school. We designed and implemented a study that assessed the viability of intervening to improve the reading comprehension skills of this group of children. This again was a randomized controlled trial. We selected children with reading comprehension impairment by screening around 1,000 children in 20 different classrooms. And in each class we identified the 8 children with the weakest reading comprehension skills, and those kids were then randomly assigned to 4 different groups, and the groups were an oral language intervention group, a text comprehension intervention group, a group that received both of those forms of intervention combined, and a waiting list control group. I should say I was convinced that this would be the most effective, but I was wrong. And we used the same way of delivering this intervention as in the previous Nuffield study I described to you. Teaching alternated between individual and teaching in pairs, and all of the teaching was delivered by teaching assistants who were employed by the schools. Actually, on the grant we had provided the schools with the money to pay the teaching assistants, but the teaching assistants were all employees of the schools. So the design here then is to compare an oral language intervention, a text comprehension intervention, or a combined intervention in English primary school classrooms. So the basic contrast here is between 2 very different programs. The oral language program is essentially a version of the oral language program I described to you in the Nuffield project, except that was delivered to kids who were around 5, and this is with kids who are around 8 years of age. But the basic components are training children in vocabulary, training them in listening comprehension, training them in so-called figurative language use, and training them in spoken narrative. So spoken narrative mostly involves getting children to tell stories from picture prompts. Figurative language use involves work on similes and jokes. Listening comprehension involves children listening to short stories and then having discussions with their teachers about what the stories were about. And vocabulary is simply the direct instruction in vocabulary knowledge that we think is of an appropriate level of difficulty for these kids. It's important to emphasise that this programme is all speech-based. It involves no books at all. And we compared that with the text comprehension programme, which was based on our reading of the literature on good ways of teaching reading comprehension. This is all based on children reading books and having discussions with their teaching assistants about the meaning of the stories they're reading and how they can better understand them. And we then had this combined programme which took all of the elements from this and put them together in a rather complex mix. And there was an untreated control group, as I've already said. So again, this was a 20-week programme. Each lesson was 30 minutes duration, and children received 2 sessions where they were taught in pairs and 1 session where they were taught individually per week. So they got 1.5 hours additional help in school over 20 weeks. And here's a little bit about the, again, as in all of the interventions I've talked about, this is a highly scripted, highly prescriptive programme in which the teaching assistants are given a list of activities to go through with worksheets to use that are appropriate, and they're given a very clear indication of how long they should be doing each of the different activities for. Here's the kind of design then. We screened and pre-tested the kids. We then randomly assigned them to 4 different groups. We reassessed them in the middle of the intervention, at the end of the intervention, and then we did a maintenance test some 12 months after the intervention had finished, and only then did the children in the control group then receive additional teaching. Okay, these are data from an ANCOVA model comparing each of the intervention groups to the control group at immediate post-test and a delayed post-test some 12 months later. What you can see is that all 3 groups have show improvements that are statistically significant compared to the untreated control group. At immediate follow-up, the text comprehension and the oral language intervention group show about the same improvement, which is about 3 standard score points. The combined groups show a slightly stronger, but not statistically significantly different improvement at immediate post-test. But the very striking thing about these data is that at delayed post-test, that's 12 months after the intervention has finished, the oral language group show the strongest effect, which is actually significantly larger effect than they showed at immediate post-test. This is a very surprising pattern of results. We've not yet replicated it. I wouldn't like to bet all of my life saving on this being a true effect, but what I think this suggests is that for this group we've effected some really significant changes in these children's kind of metacognitive approach to language learning, and that they're now much more actively engaged learners as a result of having this oral language intervention that has changed their approach somewhat to learning.
Charles, before you go off on that
Sure.
line, are the standard errors really so huge at the follow-up?
Yeah, so these are these error bars are 95% CIs from an ANC-over in M+ with cluster estimators.
So, but for the TC and the combined?
Oh, this is a very large standard error, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah.
So something funny's happened there.
Well, something funny. There's variability.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's certainly variability. This is a re-representation of those data as a structural equation model. These are actually the unstandardized path weights for dummy codes representing the difference between each of these groups and the control group. All of this shows really is that this group at delayed follow-up shows the largest improvement, which is an improvement of about 8 standard score points on a standardized reading comprehension test. This is a very large effect. Again, we can look at the extent to which these group effects are mediated via a measure of vocabulary knowledge taken at the end of the intervention. This is a somewhat complicated measure of vocabulary. It's a measure of the children's ability to define words that they've been taught during the intervention in the oral language and combined groups, as well as their ability to define words that they weren't taught but which were of comparable difficulty. Anyway, what we find here is that for the oral language and combined group, we get significant path weights to vocabulary as we would expect, but not in the text comprehension group who didn't receive any vocabulary intervention training. And for these two groups, vocabulary is a mediator of reading comprehension outcome. It's actually a complete mediator for this group and a partial mediator for that group. I don't want to push this model too far, but it's at least consistent with the causal theory that was one of the things that we were looking at in this study, which is that variations in children's understanding of spoken vocabulary items is one critical, probably causal influence on variations in children's ability to comprehend text.
Sorry, how's gender coded in that model?
Gender was dummy coded.
So the negative 2 is for boys or girls?
I think boys were ones, so I think boys are doing worse, doing less well. Yeah. Okay, just to summarise this study then, all 3 of these interventions produced positive effects on children's reading comprehension abilities, but the largest effects at delayed follow-up were in the purely oral language condition. That's somewhat surprising, I think, because the oral language condition involved no reading at all, right? It only involved oral language exercises. Those gains were mediated by variations in vocabulary learning. And I think broadly these results are very consistent with the view that the underlying oral language deficits in poor comprehenders are causally related to their reading comprehension problems. I'm not going to talk to you about this today, but since this study, we've done another study with starting in nursery classrooms and going through the first 2 terms of formal education in the UK, and shown that an oral language intervention programme for kids selected to have the weakest oral language skills in each class shows direct transfer to improve reading comprehension. So we've actually got now quite a bit more data showing that this general approach to improving children's oral language comprehension abilities does generalise to produce improvements in their reading comprehension skills. So, just a few general conclusions. I hope I've persuaded you that learning to read builds upon a child's oral language skills. I've taught you about different aspects of language skills relating to different components of learning to read, and in particular I've shown you evidence that problems in learning to decode print depend critically upon phonological or speech sound difficulties, and difficulties learning to comprehend text depend upon broader oral language abilities, 2 critical abilities being children's knowledge of the meanings of words and children's ability to deal with the grammatical structure of speech. It follows that there are different forms of reading disorder, the 2 best recognised of which are dyslexia and reading comprehension impairment. I've shown you evidence that both of those disorders can be successfully improved by suitable teaching. And just one sort of health warning, I would really want to emphasise that none of this research should be seen as providing a quick fix for children's reading and language difficulties. Most of the kids we work with probably, ideally, would require ongoing support through their school careers, and they're not getting that. But what we have done in a range of studies, some of which I've talked to you about today, is to show in pretty well-controlled studies that particular forms of teaching can produce effects that are both statistically and educationally significant. But that's not to say that's all these kids need. Our interventions, for reasons of funding, typically last 20 or 30 weeks, and that's not really the ideal in the real world, but that's what we get funding to do. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.